Cadell Last, who is a doctor of philosophy and the author of the books Global Brain, Singularity, and Sex, Masculinity, and God. And he's also a prolific YouTube philosopher. So Cadell, thanks for coming on the show. How's it going?
Hi, thanks for having me, Arran. Great to be here.
Awesome. So I'm really excited to talk to Cadell because he is exploring topics that I'm actually really interested in. He's probably the first guest so far on this show that has had that kind of overlap with me, where what he wants to talk about is probably really what I want to talk about too. And there's a deep intellectual resonance there for me, at least. And Cadell first commented on my own videos on my channel, which I was surprised at because I was already a big fan of him. But he watched my Torch series, which is just sort of kicking off. I've only got 2 episodes right now, and hopefully that'll accelerate a little bit, but it's been slow going. But we're going to start with the Torch. So the concept of the Torch is essentially, it's a story, it's a metaphor, it's my attempt to kind of provide a framework, or maybe even a mythology of the meaning of life, you might say. And something that I perceive as lacking from the consciousness of a lot of people is what's the point of anything, or how to argue why something is good or bad. Like, the kind of moral hierarchy of our culture seems very confused, and the Torch has been something that for me has been sort of an arrival at a moral framework that I think really works. I think things start to make sense in life a lot more. I think people can kind of find reason and motivation for why they do the things they do and why they want the things they want, and maybe what they should aim for in their life. And I'm curious, Cadell, we haven't really talked about it that much, but I'm curious what your impression is of the Torch as an idea and the videos so far.
Yeah, I'm a real big fan of your Torch series and of your engagement in this intellectual space. I mean, I want to also sort of presence that when I was on the Stoa to introduce sex, masculinity, and God, I really appreciated the questions that you were sort of pushing to the forefront, and I feel like your engagement with this intellectual space is really seems sincere and deep. So I just want to let you know that as well.
Thank you.
I think that the Torch idea, how I would interpret it in my symbolism, is almost like the life force, or eros. And it's sort of a gesture of, before we start to intellectualize what is our being, like, what are we, what is the givenness of our being, and if we're not intellectualizing with a deep knowledge of what we are, then our intellectualization can quickly become a castle in sand and fall to pieces. And I think that most of academic work and most of intellectual work today is so fundamentally disconnected from what you call the Torch that we're really in a deep shadow, to use the language that might be used in your other podcast work.
Yeah.
So I mean, just to situate maybe quickly,
the
Torch idea. I mean, I think there's some interesting connections with both the foundation of philosophy and the foundation of psychoanalysis with the torch.
Okay.
Because with the foundation of philosophy, you have the notion of Plato's cave shadows, where the source of the light is not understood by the people playing in the cave shadows. That's the offer I would give for the foundation of philosophy and the potential connection with this idea of the torch. Then with the foundation of psychoanalysis, you have the grounding of knowledge in the problems of libidinal life, or the problems of eros, not the romanticization of eros, crucially, not the romanticization of eros, but the problems of eros. What are the claims of the mind? What are the claims of the speech of human beings as it relates to the problems of eros? And that's where psychoanalysis begins. So this attempt to unify our knowledge with the torch, I think, stretched to the foundations. And I think that I see your work as going to the foundations, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's great. That's that's a better articulation of these ideas than I've heard from anyone else so far. And that's what's so exciting about talking with you, is to really kind of unpack this. And it is foundational. It is trying to get to like the very lowest layers of reality in some sense, and kind of provide some first principles to build on top of to make sense of our world, to make sense of our lives. And just for anyone who's listening who's not familiar with the videos that we're talking about, the torch, or maybe just watch the videos but still don't really get the concept, the torch is essentially the idea that what life does, and you could even maybe argue that things pre-life do this, but what life does is essentially, it's this stream of life, eros, I think is a good way to phrase it, but it's a stream of life that creates avatars, material manifestations, in order to continue a cycle of self-replication. That's kind of the biology of it. But this whole idea is that life is essentially carrying some kind of energy, and the energy is kind of like this fire that can't go out, and you're passing it along to the next generation. And you look at humans, and I think this used to be self-evident. I think it just used to be like, that's life. And I think we've gotten a little bit detached from that. We've sort of abstracted out of it into some sort of virtual reality that doesn't really map on to what I would say is the real anymore. But people are, very, very tied to sex. They really want sex. I think that's pretty obvious. And people want to have children, or at least they used to. And the kind of foundations of what is good and bad, what we should and should not do, kind of revolves around this idea of passing something on to the next generation, which could be genetic, but it's also cultural, which is like an important wrinkle here. But it's as if each one of us is carrying some kind of energy. And I think a torch is like the best metaphor. And we're trying to pass that on in some way. Maybe we pass it on through having kids. Maybe we pass it on through our ideas and our concepts and our culture, our actions. But that's really what life is. And if you don't see life that way, or if you abstract out of that into some sort of narcissistic individualism, which is like, life is about my experience, or life is about my feeling good, you can't really have much motivation or reason to do anything. And that's like why it's so confusing to me, because the torch seems, to me, it seems self-evident. It seems like clearly this is what we do. And the fact that we've kind of lost that, or we've gotten so noisy in our intellectual space that we're kind of losing sight of that, is what's so, let's say, tragic, but also sort of anxiety inducing. Anyway, so that's kind of an explanation of the torch, basically, to maybe ground the rest of this conversation for anyone who hadn't seen the videos.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that it's situated here in this idea of the torch. I think it's really situated here at this intellectual, I don't know how to call it, this intellectual nexus or turning point that I have come to relate to as the meeting place of Nietzsche and Freud is what I call it, the meeting place of Nietzsche and Freud. And it's really the meeting place of philosophy and psychology. And the reason why that meeting point is so important is because it brings us to questions of fundamental value. It brings us to questions of fundamental morality. And it brings us to questions of fundamental, I think, emotional turmoil. And I think that's what's going on at that meeting point. And the way I hear your explication and explanation of the torch and how you're trying to connect it to our present moment, I think that it forces us to wrestle with the deepest philosophical questions, but really in a way that pre-Nietzschean or pre-Freudian philosophers just had no clue, for various historical reasons, not because of their lack of intellect, but precisely somehow the problems raised by you in this torch series and the problems that I perceive to be raised by figures like Nietzsche and Freud are problems that appear uniquely to our historical moment, almost as if this historical moment forces these problems onto us in a way that was just irrelevant to previous human beings. Like for example, if Freud were to go to a time machine and go to a past hunter-gatherer society and talk about the problems of hysteria and obsessional neuroses, the hunter-gatherers would just be like, what are you talking about, man? Like that's not our life. That's you're in the, like the problems he was raising are really problems for nervous systems and the problems of nervous systems and psychical systems that are unique to massive industrialized information age societies.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the mental health problems, the kind of pathologies, in every way that you can even think of, a pathology, some sort of thing we'd say is wrong with someone, or some way in which they are broken, wounded, traumatized. Those all, to me, they make sense in the context of some sort of decoherence from the torch. The torch as being some sort of aim, or some sort of, you might even say, like immaterial mass almost. People are kind of spiraling around the torch. They have some sort of aim in their life, and all their instincts, their physiology is pointing towards it. Like, people are trying to get to this thing. They're aiming for the top of this peak in some sense. And they're doing that in the ways that they want sex. It's like they're trying to do something through sex, or something is happening to the body, which is seeking sex, or seeking to exist within sex. And the desires that have to do with some sort of intellectual satisfaction have to do with this drive to materialize reality, turn reality into objects so you can use it to build things, so you can use it to kind of unpack your problems and solve them. Those are still pointing towards this thing, the torch. Like, people are trying to get there and they don't know it, but everything about you is going there. It's not just the way that we see reality. It's like the very objects of reality are constructed around the torch. The reason that you see things as red and blue and green is in some sense aiming at the torch. And I think that the pathologies, as to loop it back around, the pathologies are a product of some sort of decoherence with that aim. And almost like in attempting to climb that peak, something is happening as we move towards modernity that disrupts that trajectory, and it starts to make you just sort of oscillate out of control. And people are still pushing and pushing towards the torch, but they're also being, in some sense, disrupted. And so it just turns into this sort of like thrashing, ripping apart of people's entire being, their psychology, but also their bodies, in ways that seem obvious if you really think about it, but I still think we're confused about it. When we think about what's wrong with people or why they're struggling or why they're having trouble, like children, why are children traumatized? It's because their little bodies are developing with this aim of bearing the torch, and they're thrown into an environment where that drive is actually putting them at some sort of disadvantage. It's becoming maladaptive in our current environment. And that's sort of, I would say, is the core of the personal struggle that kind of ripples outwards into the collective struggle, and results in sort of a society that's going insane and eating itself, all in an attempt to get back to this place, that top of the peak, that top of the moral structure is how I would phrase it.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because I think that in at least my relationship to the figures like Nietzsche and Freud, they both are wrestling with the absence of God fundamentally. And when you say that the very objects of our reality are constructed around the torch, at least let me know how you think about this, is it the torch of our being, the eros of our being, is trying to construct some central point of, if that makes sense. Like, it's not that there's some being that already exists which we're trying to organize around. It's that there's something missing, which is signaled by the presence of the structure of our being. Like, the first is the structure of our being.
Yeah.
But the presence of the structure of our being points towards something missing.
Yeah.
And in that something missing, there's the inability to account for it with our individual being, and also to link with other beings in such a way as that it can be maintained. And in that, sexuality is fundamental. First, the starting point, sexuality, to me, like in terms of the structure of our being. And the reason why you have to say that first, and that's just going on basically Freud's, the main idea that he was ridiculed for in the beginning, was he was saying that there's childhood sexuality, that the infant's body, the baby's body, the child's body is a libidinal body. That's what was heretical. So the body is a body of, so the crucial thing here, and this is to separate us from, not separate us from, but add to the Darwinian evolutionary universe, is that when it comes to the torch, and here I'm the torch, eros, life force, sexuality.
Yeah.
So in the Darwinian universe, sexuality is understood in terms of reproduction, meaning passing on the torch.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Freudian universe, we're dealing with enjoyment, pleasure, I'm having sex because I'm going to have a child. I'm having sex because there's something of my being that makes me feel alive, that I exist at all. And so somehow this energy needs to be found in a space, or a space needs to be maintained and created for it by those beings themselves, that allows this energy a home across a very long period of time, decades. And the previous structure which enabled that was monotheistic religion. So this is the very strange metaphysical structure we're working with, it seems, because okay, you have religion, monotheistic religions, which were created by a different type of mind in the ancient past and has carried to the present. You have a deep doubt, skepticism, criticism of this metaphysical structure, which was holding our entire being. But nonetheless, we doubt it, skeptical of it, not sure if this is the structure that's the truth. And then you have the emergence of tremendous emotional struggles. That's what happens when you remove the religious structure. When you remove the religious structure, what you find is deep, intimate, emotional, affective, psychical disturbances which need some sort of alternative meaning-making structures or something to hold their energy in the present moment of their being. But also because the present moment always becomes another moment, meaning that the present moment is a succession of moments, in a way that it maintains somehow the immortality or the eternity. Our words here are stupid. The immortality or the eternity of this energy, which will pass through my body and to another body. But in some way, what I am as an individual still needs to be respected for my being. That I'm not reduced to somehow, like I can be used for this higher chain and just disregarded as an entity. That's what we call slavery. And that's how many times women were used. That's many times how slaves were used. And that was supported by religious metaphysics. Like the idea that women and slaves and other people, poor people in general, could be used for this larger process is something that we don't want to return to. So we have to wrestle with the deepest problems of the heart. And then if we wrestle with the deepest problems of the heart, which is how I imagine what Nietzsche and Freud's project is, then a different world, a better world is possible and is being made by us right now, I think. The fact that we're even having these conversations is proof that it is possible and we are trying to do it.
Yeah, there's a lot. I don't know where to take this.
Does that situate within your understanding of the torch and how this is unfolding?
It does. I mean, it makes contact with a lot of the mysteries, I think, that are troubled, that I would say that trouble me in some sense. There's feelings of there's essentially certain questions, or there's certain sort of objects of my philosophy or my reality that kind of seem almost like anti-objects. I don't know if that's the proper word, but it's like they just seem receding. It's like you can't actually find a way to make them sort of concrete because they keep receding into mystery. And I think that you're tapping into some of those with some of the things you're saying. You brought up God is a big question. God is a concept that has increasingly become an important exploration for me, which, you know, I think will probably take anyone off guard who finds themselves in that situation, especially if you are not, if you have no conception of God other than something that is absurd and silly as a child. It can catch you off guard that God becomes like this central question, but it has become that way. And you mentioned something that kind of sounded like God and nothingness, or sort of the void, the thing that's lacking. The biology is sort of has this gap inside of it that it's trying to fill, which to me sounds like God, almost that God is this sort of forever receding hole that you strive to fill throughout your lifetime, and your children will strive to fill it after you, and your children will strive to fill it after them. And it's just sort of this receding container. And like at the center, almost like if you have this sort of circling around some aim or some higher moral principle, like God, let's say, there's like a circle, and at the center of the circle is a hole. It's like you never actually get to the center of the circle. It's always just infinitely sort of receding away. And the kind of something else you brought up was sort of the immortality of the energy that's passing through our bodies. There is that energy is striving to last forever, or it's striving to join with the infinite in some way. It's striving to join with God, who is a sort of receding, passageway almost, and the immortal energy is just sort of striving for it. And that's sort of my conception of reality in a very abstract sort of metaphysical sense, is that kind of immortal striving towards the infinite nothingness in some sense. But again, I mean, you know, these are just words, and
no, it's very interesting. And it's very interesting because, like, let's think about it in terms of a strange angle, maybe. I'm going to invoke Richard Dawkins. So, and this might be very strange invoking this, but in some sense, with his major work, The Selfish Gene, he even says, I shouldn't have called the book The Selfish Gene. He says, I should have called the book The Immortal Gene. The reason why is a technical, biologically accepted, long-known metaphysical presupposition of the life sciences, which is, and this is part of the neo-Darwinian revolution, which Dawkins sees himself as a major part of, which is that the individual genes are merely vehicles for the reproduction of the genetic code itself, the lineage of genes themselves. In that sense, and Freud knew this already, the gene line is immortal. The genes are temporal, finite, mortal. And so the individual bodies, here's the point of the selfish gene, the individual bodies are in some sense sacrificed, agents of sacrifice. Here I love, because it's so subversive to me, because you can use religious terminology to describe this biological foundation, which is supposedly atheistic in its nature. This is the subversive element. The genes are sacrificed for the immortal gene line, which will continue and go on and on and on and on and on forever. And that's an interesting metaphysical understanding of biology, which is this. If you think of biology in itself will just go on forever. It'll never stop. The only thing that will stop biology, life, is the fact that the physical foundation for life is itself finite. Meaning our solar system will come to an end. And ultimately the universe will come to an end. If that weren't the case, biology in itself is immortal. Not the individual organisms, but the phenomenon would just keep reproducing itself forever. So there's this immortal striving, the gene line, which is just, as you say, in an infinite nothingness. So you have this immortal striving and this infinite nothingness. And then what happens somehow? You get the appearance of a subject, which is not just a biological entity somehow, but is, and not even, maybe even it's not something more than a biological entity, but rather is just a biological entity that's aware. Like Adam and Eve in the garden, and they cover up their genitals. Nothing has changed. They're still apes, but with a difference. The difference is just that they're aware. They have a self-reflectivity. I am an entity. And this becomes the major feature of its entire existence. I am. And somehow this self-awareness contains within it everything, but in itself it's nothing. But it contains everything, because the I, where is the idea of the Big Bang and physics and cosmology and all the planets and all the solar systems and all the galaxies and all the universe that's all going to go on for billions of years and come to nothingness, and all the life and all the history of the universe and the evolution of everything and all of that? Where is that? That's coming from me. I represented that. Otherwise, it has no minimal self-reflectivity. It's just, what is it? We don't know. We can't know what that is. It's something that doesn't involve what I am at all. So even my positing that it has an existence independent of me is suspect. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
But I'm trying to link it here with this immortal striving and the infinite nothingness. This is fundamental, I think.
Yeah. The simultaneity of I am everything and nothing at the same time, I think, is a deep paradox. And in many ways, because I've argued about this with a lot of people, I've kind of argued about this sort of am I everything or am I nothing kind of thing. And it's interesting how people often are very strongly in favor of one philosophy over the other.
And here's where crucially, a crucial moment where we go into Hegelian philosophy, where it's not I am everything, I am nothing. I am paradox. I am not one thing. I am both things at the same time, and I have to wrestle with that eternally. And I don't, and the people who don't want to wrestle with that, they say I'm just one thing.
Right. And I think this is, I don't know, this seems fundamental to what I would say is figuring out the meaning of life in some sense, is that question. Is there actually is that tension is really, it's like insurmountable almost.
Yes. Here's the line from The Science of Logic from Hegel. The essential moment of the concept is contradiction. The essential moment. The essential moment is not one pre-existing thing that always existed and always will exist. The essential moment is the very inability for identity to know what it is. That's the essential moment. And to wrestle with that, to be with that tension, and to be at peace with that tension. I am this contradictory thing. And that's my heart. My heart constantly evading clear conceptualization. You know? My heart, which cannot just be, I cannot just put my heart in a box and just have it nice and stable. And also, if I don't have a box for my heart, then I'm just in a void by myself with my pain. And that's what I am somehow.
I see being as that sort of interplay between needing the box, needing the container, and the conclusion that there is no container, or the a different way of phrasing it, that because it's interesting, you see the synthesis happening with these different ideas, but the sort of notion of like the hero and on the hero's journey as being something that mediates between this force of nothingness consuming the world and somethingness that he is trying to, in some sense, bring about somethingness, fighting against the force of nothingness, and forever manifesting somethingness over and over again. And there's sort of like the chaos order kind of thing that the hero is sort of mediating between these two forces of disintegration and integration. And that's really what, I mean, it's kind of like universal in some sense, like all entities are sort of experience this integrative, disintegrative tension, but that the hero specifically, and the hero as sort of the I, is sort of the force that mediates between the two, or is forever caught in that torsion, that paradox in some sense of mediating between disintegration and integration. And that's sort of where meaning comes from in many ways, supposedly, is that mediation.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that when we think about this duality of chaos and order, something and nothing, what's always forgotten is what is this hero? What is this I that's mediating chaos and order? What is this thing it's neither integration nor disintegration? It's neither order nor chaos. It's both and more, it's both and less, it's both and, it seems like the I, or the hero, I prefer it just say the I, is just this most basic being of an individual, and this most basic being of an individual that's always now. And its individual nowness, what it is both chaos and order. It's both integration and disintegration. I like the word chaotic. I like the word, I don't know what word to use, because again, like you're saying, it's almost like every word is insufficient because it is the force of the word as such. It's not any word I can say to you other than it's our very speech and conversation this moment is the word, is what we're talking about. And I guess this is being brought to consciousness, whereas in the religious history and throughout all human history, it was operating unconsciously. I can give you an example. My mother raised 3 children in a single parent household on welfare, working multiple jobs. And if you ask her about this time in her life, she'd say, I just did it. She wasn't consciously deeply aware of what she was doing. And if she was consciously deeply aware of what she was doing, it might be so overwhelming that she wouldn't be able to do it. There's a great Aesop fable told by Osho where he talks about a frog and a frog and a centipede, where the frog is perplexed that the centipede can walk with 100 legs. And he goes to the centipede and says, my God, every morning I get up and I see you going on a morning walk. But please tell me, with 100 legs, how do you do it? And the centipede says, I've never thought about it. And now that you mention it, I actually think I'm going to have trouble walking. So you see what the problem is, and this is to help us understand what psychoanalysis is. It's about the centipede, which is already walking, to become aware of what it is and how strange that is, and then to still be able to do what it's doing, which is go on a walk, with the knowledge of what you are. So it's almost like when it comes to human beings, when we're asked to be a father, it's the equivalent of, if I ask you about becoming a father, it would be the equivalent of the frog going to the centipede and asking, how do you walk with 100 legs? Being asked the question and having it brought to consciousness would be enough to say, I don't know if I can do that. But somehow we still have to do that and be conscious about it. It's almost like the entire metaphysical structure of religion is an unconscious saving of a challenge that's been built up through historical being, and we have to make it conscious and it actually embody it. And that's what Nietzsche was complaining about. He was complaining about all these Christians who talked a big metaphysical game and talked a big morality game and said that they had the values and the morals and but he said, you're empty. You don't really walk the talk. You're not really the overman.
Again, there's sort of a fork in the road of which way to take this, but one question, I'm not sure how to phrase this correctly, but maybe you'll get the gist of what I mean. Do you, in this way, do you see consciousness as being some sort of biological mistake? As in, becoming conscious is just like, whoops, like what did we just do? Like, oh fuck, everything's fucked up now. Like, do you see it that way?
I see that the location of the truth for consciousness is a mistake, meaning that the appearance of consciousness, the appearance of awareness, happens in it happens in the place of a gap, or it happens in the place of a gap or a failure internal to materiality. It's nothing but that gap or failure. Identifying with something perfect, some strong image, like from your diary this morning, or a few days ago, sorry. You say that a lot of men stay in the image of a strong image, whereas the paradoxical strength is identifying with weakness. This is the Nietzschean observation, which is that the religious man who's identifying with a perfect image, an image of strength, is actually weak. Whereas the strong man is the man who cries. The strong man is the man who is aware of the pain of being and can still walk. It's that, like, now I'll reference Lacan. Lacan said, the ego is nothing but frustration. What he means by that is the very formation of the ego, which for Lacan is on the level of an image, not a brain, an image, the location of the ego is a buildup of a reaction formation to a mistake or a failure or something going wrong. Think about how consciousness is experiencing birth. It comes out crying. Think about the maturation of an infant. In order to get its needs met, it cries, it screams, it wails to get its needs met, because it's impotent, it's weak. The baby is the weakest thing. It can't do anything by itself. And that is how we come to be. That was me. That was you. What I am is a condensation of images that have helped me fill the gap of being. And that precisely, I think it's very simple what I'm saying. That is not reflectively incorporated by mainstream philosophy and science and religion, and they don't realize that their identities are frustrated images. And they identify with a powerful image of themselves, that I have a certain title. You know, I always see as the most weakest possible gesture. There was a guy, I'm not going to name him. There was a guy at an institute I worked as a postdoc who would sign his emails with a very long list of all of his degrees. It's my name with 7, 8, 9 professional distinctions. And it's like, at what point would you get a degree where you don't feel like nothing? That's what you're signaling. But that image of strength is a defense. So you see the enormity of the task before us, which is to find our strength in the deepest pain and to still show up and continue to walk and continue to hold up the world and to actually be good. There's a huge difference, I think, between the image of goodness and actually being good.
Yeah.
And that notion here, that consciousness as a biological mistake, it's an important one, and it's technically precise. Because what the scientists and the neuroscientists are basically saying, and they're wrong, but they are pointing in the right direction, which is that what we are as agents, they'll talk about us as agents in a neurobiological framework, is that we are problem solvers. So what does that imply? See, now they're pointing in the right direction, but they miss the metaphysical frame necessary to contain what they're talking about, in my view. So what are they saying, though? That we agents, we neurobiological agents are problem solvers, is that there must be some mistake. Otherwise, what do we solve? Why are we reduced to problem solvers? There must be something wrong. But they don't get to the point that it's the appearance of a conscious I at all requires that there be something wrong with being.
How much time do you have?
Not a concern at the moment.
Not a concern. Okay. Something else you mentioned that I want to explore is I think you were referring to Christianity specifically, but sort of religion as sort of the, how would I phrase this? The savior sort of the consciousness crisis of some kind, that it's sort of like a structure, a container that resolves this kind of this crisis of I in some sense. I'm not sure how you were describing it, but that, it's removal. It's sort of the death of God in some way as kind of an obliteration of this container. And I guess, do you see religion evolving in the first place as being some kind of it's not intelligent almost, it's almost like a structure that just evolves on its own, like a cultural structure that evolves on its own to answer the paradox of nothingness and somethingness, or disintegration, integration? Is that how you would describe it? I'm not sure how you were phrasing it.
Religion, in my view, religion is unconscious. Meaning, when you say, do you see religion evolving in the first place as something that evolves on its own? Yes. It evolves from the intelligence of the unconscious. Which is why it has a psychological significance, to give reference to Jordan Peterson's biblical lecture series. So Jordan Peterson did a biblical lecture series on Christianity, and he had the subtitle as the psychological significance of. It has a psychological significance because where it comes from is us. Mm-hmm. And we're psyches, social, in a society, collection of psyches is a society. And what holds this collection of historical psyches is something that we call religion. And then you have the emergence of a rational enlightenment philosophy, which is skeptical of it, which doubts it, which is critical of it. It's the best historical example is in the French Revolution, where figures like Robespierre, and I loved Robespierre when I was a teenager, but it also shows the immaturity of Robespierre. He wanted to have all society rationally ordered. He thought, why do we have a 7-day week? Why don't we have a 10-day week? That would be more rational. Let's have the cathedrals not be religious, but let's have them be some sort of public institutions. He wanted everything to be rational. Of course, what happened to Robespierre is he had his head cut off. But the point is that there's this rational philosophy which turns out to be irrational once it becomes historically embodied. So in order to be rational, we first have to start with the torch. We have to start with our embodied historical existence. then there's the possibility that we could have a rational analysis. But I don't think that that rational analysis would lead to a scientific, rational, atheistic world. Because I think it would have to contend with the mysteries of the heart. And that's the clue to understanding Hegel. That's it. That's the clue.
Can we, let's see, segue a little bit to the global brain singularity? Is that going to be too jarring of a transition, or I feel like there's a easy connection to what we're already talking about?
Yeah, you just however you like to go into that.
The global brain singularity, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sort of I haven't read the book, obviously, but I'm sort of interpreting this as culture as something that evolves. It's not culture is not intelligent, I guess is the way I would phrase it. Maybe you would dispute that, but that it's something that is evolving beyond us or above us. It's something that is sort of at this stage is certainly recruiting us and recruiting consciousness as sort of cells in its body in some way, almost as if we find ourselves caught inside this meta organism, is kind of the way that I've been phrasing it in my own work. But we find ourselves caught inside this meta organism as cells in its structure increasingly, and it's almost as if there's a culture, there's a structure to our society that we're all kind of caught in, that none of us chose to be caught in. Like, it was inherited in some ways, but it's quite possible that we find ourselves in roles and in locations and positions that we're not really choosing to be in, and we're sort of fulfilling a purpose that doesn't necessarily serve anyone or anything as much as it serves some sort of global body of some kind that is itself an organism that maybe doesn't care so much, maybe doesn't care so much about human flourishing or thriving. That's my interpretation. You can kind of refine that.
Okay. So we just have to be careful with the way we frame this phenomenon with a certain implied value system, and we have a certain us versus them. We are supposedly on one side and it is supposedly on another side, where I think it's more of a contradiction, where we're probably both, because I don't really see my biology as my friend either. I don't see, Terence McKenna has the line of culture is not your friend. I don't see biology or culture as my friend. Neither of them are my friend. I don't think either of them care about me. It's like the classical Freudian notion of the mind, of the id, the ego, and the superego. We could say the id is biology. We could say the superego is culture. And I'm just caught between this insanity. So there's a video I want to recommend to capture what you're talking about.
Okay.
It's called Amoeba Eats Two Paramecia.
Okay.
Brackets Amoeba's Lunch, end bracket. On YouTube, can be found. How many views does it have? Has 1.8 million views. And 6,000 likes and 255 dislikes. Anyway, okay. So the amoeba and the paramecia video, what you see are paramecium minding their own business, and then amoeba comes and surrounds the paramecium, is in a total circle, closing in on them, and they're not aware that it's happening. They're closed in on before they become aware that they've been closed in on. Then, once they've been closed in on totally, they become aware that they've been closed in on, and there's no escape. And then they become consumed into the body of the amoeba and ultimately become dissolved into the amoeba, and then the amoeba is just gone on. That's its lunge. So this phenomenon, this event I'm describing, that's how I think we should understand biology and language, or biology and culture in history. The model would be the great apes are the paramecia sitting there minding their own business. Then language or culture are the amoeba, and it consumes them, circles in on them on all sides into a perfect circle. And once it's closed in on them, they realize that they've been closed in on. And then they start to struggle against language. And that's history. All the wars of history. I'm going to die for this symbol. I'm going to die for this symbol. I'm going to be killed for this symbol. And so forth. Until the battle is over and they become language itself. Maybe. Maybe that's the singularity. This is just a metaphor idea of how one might model, how one might think about this whole process. But I don't identify with any part of the process. I don't identify as a biological entity, and I don't identify as a symbolic entity. I don't identify with any of that. I'm just merely observing what it seems to be that's happening, which is that there's a relationship, an antagonistic relationship, a tension between biology and culture. And that tension is embodied in the active metaphysics of religious views, where they always are trying to cover up that we're animals, and that sex and our defecation, our urination, our primitive nature, our animal nature should be seen as shame and guilt on that. Whereas the cultural side, the civilized side is seen as primary and to be seen as privileged. And that there's a process to it, meaning that there's a direction to it. It's the direction is away from biology and towards culture. It's not both ways. And also, the further back you go in time, there would be more biology and less culture. The idea that there's a progressive teleological direction towards becoming more civilized, more cultured, more enlightened, more aware, and so forth. And then here you would situate Freud's book, Civilization and its Discontents. Meaning the entities going through this process seem to be having a lot of emotional problems. They're discontent. There's affective disturbances here that we have to pay attention to, and we need to understand what it is that's going on. And what he always describes are the trade-offs that we as individuals need to make, and the sacrifices that we as individuals need to make in order to have a civilization at all. Because if we as individuals are just acting on our base impulses and instincts, there would be nothing but, Freud said the core of the unconscious was incest, cannibalism, and killing, sex and death, basically sex and killing, that's the mystery. That energy gets civilized. And so you'll have, for example, a philosopher in a battle with another philosopher using symbols, trying to destroy each other. All ultimately so that they can, in some evolutionary framework, increase their fitness, increase their capacity to have sex with a desirable woman or something. You see what? So Global Brain Singularity is a book that tries, as my dissertation, which is my attempt to come up with a theory of evolution which would make sense in light of the potentiality of technological singularity. Not saying anything morally about it. I'm not on any side. I'm just merely observing a phenomenon which is now in the popular discourse. Now, when I was first interested in this, like I was becoming obsessed with the technological singularity, nobody knew anything about it. It was in obscure nerd circles. Nerds were obsessed with it, or whatever you want to call it. The intellectual nerds, on their own time, they didn't have any institutional support. They were just interested in it. And now it's become the foundational ideology of Silicon Valley. And the foundational figures of the technological singularity are now working on manifesting it. And now it's in popular discourse. I just read an article today about Elon Musk in the mainstream popular press talking about hooking a monkey up to a brain-machine interface and having it play video games. That's in the mainstream press now. And I'm saying that when I was first becoming aware of this back in 2005, 2004, this was not anywhere on the radar. And so now it's, everyone knows about it. And now we need more philosophical conversation about it. And we need more deep wisdom about how we're going to deal with the objective fact that these technologies are here and they're not going anywhere. Brain-machine interface technology is here now. Monkeys are hooked up to it. Humans are hooked up to it. Humans are hooked up to it who have neurological problems. Those are the first humans that'll be hooked up. But guess what? And Freud knew this. We all have neurological problems. That's universal. That's what he was interested in. He was interested in neurotic illnesses, neurosystem illness, neurodegenerative problems. So this is going to affect us all.
Do you see the singularity, let's say, or the global brain? Do you see it as, maybe you already said this, but do you see it as something that is actually an enemy of humanity, or is it kind of just like it's not morally good or bad? It just sort of is.
I think that so there's an interesting conversation I want to have. There's a philosopher I've been paying attention to recently who studied Heidegger, and he frames it as bad, that it's the enemy. And basically way he's framing it is it's the Silicon Valley ideology, and there's a certain type of scientific technological ideology which is dangerous because it's not really in touch with the affective, emotional problems of mankind as such. Like, that's why I go to Nietzsche and Freud, because they were aware of those. So from my side, it's that we need more deep wisdom from people like him who study Heidegger, who studied Freud, who studied Nietzsche, who studied Schopenhauer, who have gone deeply into themselves and have deep emotional knowledge of themselves, understand deeply the problems of their heart, and to bring that into conversation with the fact of the technologies that exist today. And I think the figure who I would say as the pointing torch for me in this is Esther Perel. Esther Perel is the pointing torch because she is in these circles, and you know what she says to them? And she's the perfect figure because she's a good European woman, strong, confident woman in this male-dominated tech industry. And she can say to them, look, I go to your Google whatever event, and I see future of transportation, future of money, future of corporations, future of smartphones, whatever. Where is future of love, future of intimate relationships, future of deep community? That's the question here. The question here is not whether it's good, bad, whatever. It is a fact. It exists. We did it. We made it. We also made atomic bombs. And you have figures like Richard Feynman, for example, who participated in the creation of the atomic bomb, and then after it was deployed, he had an existential breakdown. What did I do? So the same question I ask Elon Musk, Richard Feynman, same type of thinker. Not exactly, Feynman's much smarter, but Elon Musk making a brain machine interface device, hooking it up to a monkey brain, hooking it up to people who have neurological problems. What is the equivalent of a Hiroshima, a Nagasaki catastrophe that could happen here? And what is the meaning of it? What is the point? What, if anything, can contribute to us having a better understanding of the types of questions you're asking with the torch about meaning, value, morality, love? I am not at all against it. At all. My first impact, my first collision with singularity literature was, my God, what the hell? That's going to be possible? I was reading The Singularity is Near in 2005 with Ray Kurzweil's timelines about what will happen in 2045. He said the predictions of what would happen at 2030, the predictions of what would happen at 2045. And I thought, well, this all sounds possible. Not only possible, but probable. And the more I've seen it unfold, the more I see, well, it does seem like it's going to happen. What does it mean for me as a human individual nowness? That's why I wrote the Global Brain Singularity book. That's what I dedicated my life to attempt to think, because that's what I felt was necessary. I still feel it's necessary. And I think that there's some great here, and now in my own practical existence, I've seen this is coming to pass. Well, in the first decades of the 21st century, the most lucrative professions were the STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, and maths. This is what will come to pass. The most lucrative, the most important field will be philosophy. This is going to be the ultimate revenge of philosophy. Because now what's happening is, because of the force of STEM, everyone has to be a philosopher. That is the necessity now. The necessity now is that our reality is so complex and different and other than the normal life world of the human, that our very everydayness, to put Heidegger's language, the very everydayness of Dasein will require a philosophical wisdom to be able to deal with that, to be able to interpret that, to be able not to go insane.
That's a really interesting idea. And I think, I mean, I think you can see patterns of that happening in the last 5 years for sure.
The Stoa is that.
Yeah. Yeah, but Jordan Peterson, I think, is a very good example. One way that he shocked me was not necessarily his ideas, but the fact that his ideas were popular. Where it's like, why is anyone paying attention to this? It's like a lot of people are paying attention to this, and it seems emergent. It seems new that there's just sort of this never before seen hunger for philosophy, and I think essentially because people are in such a crisis of like, what the fuck is going on? I cannot make sense of anything. It's just too complex. I feel like my whole conception of the real is constantly being dismantled, just as a way of if I just go out and live, and if I'm just awake, I'm like obliterated constantly by illusion, it seems like. So what you're talking about, I think is very interesting, because like I see that pattern, and the way that you're phrasing it is a better articulation than I had before. Just like, yeah.
It's the recognition of Plato's cave. What has to happen is that here, the story is simple. We all learn about it in first year philosophy, or even high school philosophy. We learn about Plato's cave. We all learn about it. So back to basics. What is the metaphor? What is an analogy trying to capture? Is that what you perceive with your senses, and the only reality you know is your perception with your senses, your 5 senses, and your capacity to think, is that what you perceive is an illusion. That illusion is being cast from behind you by a light. What the philosopher does is notices this, goes to the light itself, the torch, if you like, and then comes back to the others looking at the illusion and says, hey guys, I got some news for you. And what happens to the philosopher who does that? He gets killed. Socrates is murdered. What awaits the philosopher for his return is the threat of death. And death. So the question becomes, and this is deeper philosophy now, and I think there's evidence for this in Plato. we don't really understand the geometry and structure of the cave. We don't understand the meaning of the cave. We don't know why the illusions are there to begin with. And we don't know if these illusions have any meaning, any significance in themselves. What does it look like? Because you can't just be with the source. This is the trap of the spiritualist and the New Age spiritualist. They get trapped in an even more illusory image than the normal everyday people. Normal everyday people should be trusted above spiritual narcissists. Normal everyday people are more reliable, they're more grounded, they're more common sense than the spiritual narcissists who are so, they may have untethered themselves, but they don't realize that untethering yourself requires that you come back to the cave with wisdom, which is the point of philosophy, and that's dark because you have to dwell in death, as Heidegger knew. Heidegger's getting to the point of what do we do with our being in the world, our Dasein. For Heidegger, we have to dwell in the point of being, which is non-being, which is death. And we have to dwell in this in order to discover our true potentiality. In Heidegger's language, our own most potentiality for being, which is a fancy way of saying your personal potential as an individual nowness. And that the dwelling in death is precisely what the people hooked up to the cave shadows are trying to guard against. Ernst Becker called it the denial of death, a Pulitzer Prize winning book, Nobel Prize winning book. The Denial of Death, famous anthropological text. And the denial of death is basically that we put up an image that would comfort us, make us feel secure. But we know that if we pay attention to our being, that this image doesn't protect us. And it prevents us even from our potential, possibly, because it keeps us into an illusion. The questions here that arise in my mind, and here I'm just speaking, you know, I'm not hiding anything. This is what I'm thinking about right now. What I'm thinking about is, what is the geometry of the cave? And this is on also Zizek's philosophy, is to think about structures, weird geometries. I think about weird geometries that Plato didn't think about. So there's a few structures that I like. I like the Mobius loop. I like the cross cap, and I like the Klein bottle. The Klein bottle is the most interesting one. These structures are mathematical objects which are non-Euclidean. They're structures which are disorienting. They're called non-orientable surfaces. The reason they're called non-orientable surfaces in mathematics is because there's no up and down, right or wrong. Like, you don't know, there's no progressive teleological direction. So these to me are Hegelian objects. because you're wrestling with paradoxes, you're wrestling with contradictions. It's not that like, it's not that like I can describe to you the nature of this non-orientable surface by giving you an example of my granddad's own intimate geometry. My granddad was driving me home, and I'm very close with my granddad. My granddad was driving me home from work when I was a teenager. And he told me, and this was a few years after his wife, his partner, who he had 4 children with and a whole life with, died. And he told me, I'm looking for the one. And I sat there in the car and I thought to myself, I didn't say this to him, I was just thinking to myself, I said, he has had a life partner. He had a wife and kids and a house and car. And that's what I think of as the one. And he's in the car telling me that he's looking for the one. So what the hell is that? How is it that he had what I think is the one and he's still looking for the one? You see, it's a non-orientable surface. It's a constant of the present moment to be searching for the one.
Mm.
You never find the one because you are the one as a constant contradiction. And then you outsource that search to another person as an image, and it always fails. So if you stay in that mode of psychical geometry and you don't realize the surface of your mind as a non-orientable surface, then you're going to constantly be in this progressive teleological illusion. You see, at 14, you're looking for the one. At 24, you're looking for the one. At 34, you're looking for the one. At 84, you're looking for the one.
All right, well, Cadell, I think we should save some for another conversation. And
I hope that was good for your listeners.
that was excellent. And again, I just sort of feel like so much overlap, so much resonance with your ideas. And I took a ton of notes because it was like, this is good stuff. Like you're refining a lot of the ideas I already have and finding better ways to articulate them, which I find incredibly useful. So it's very exciting for me. So people can find you at, if they just look for your name, right? Cadell Last.
CadellLast.com is my website. Cadell Last is my YouTube channel. If you go on my website, you'll see a very simple overview of the stuff I've written. My book, The Global Brain Singularity, is the culmination of 10 years of my that's basically what I sacrificed my 20s for. And Sex, Masculinity, and God is a book that I wrote in the gap of my own deepest problems. And I wanted to do that with 2 other men who were in a similar space where we approach as a philosophical dialogue, as a Platonic dialogue, sex, masculinity, and God.
I'll put all that in the description below the video so people can find it more easily. And yeah, I think you're brilliant, man. Just got to say that. And I look forward to talking to you again about this stuff. And even if it's not recorded, I'd still would be excited to have you sort of unpack and tear apart some of my ideas as you did today. So thanks again. And until next time. All right, see you, Cadell.